Good evening. This is Pamela, and you're listening to Watchmen on the Pod. We are going to continue in our book reading by Maria Monk, Awful Disclosures of, it's by Maria Monk, I'm sorry, Awful Disclosures, Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed. We are in chapter 15. Frequency of the priest's visits to the nunnery, their freedom and crime, difficulty of learning their names, their holy retreat, objections in our mind, means used to counteract conscience, ingenious arguments. Some of the priests from the seminary were in the nunnery day and night, wow, and often several times a day. I have been I have seen nearly all of them at different times, though there are about 150 in the district of Montreal. There was a difference in their conduct, though. I believe every one of them was guilty of licentiousness, while not one did I ever see who maintained a character any way becoming the profession of a priest. Some were gross and degraded in a degree which few of my readers could ever have imagined. I should be unwilling to offend the eye and corrupt the heart of any one by an account of their words and actions. Few imaginations can conceive deeds so abominable as they practiced, and often required of some of the poor women under the fear of severe punishment and even death. I do not hesitate to say with the strongest confidence that although some of the nuns became lost to every sentiment of virtue and honor, especially one of the Congregational Nunnery, whom I have before mentioned, St. Patrick, the greater part of them loathed the practices to which they were compelled to submit by their superior and priest, who kept them under so dreadful bondage. Some of the people whom I saw I never knew by name. The names of others I did not learn for a time, and at last learned only by accident. They were always called Mon Père, my father. But sometimes when they had purchased something in the ornament room, they would give their real name with directions where it should be sent. Many names thus learnt and in other ways were whispered about from nun to nun, and became pretty generally known. Several of the priests some of us had seen before we entered the convent. Many, hold on one minute. Oh, I did not just do that. Hold on. Let's see. Many things of which I speak from the nature of the case must necessarily rest chiefly upon my own word until further evidence can be obtained. But there are some facts for which I can appeal to the knowledge of others. It is commonly known in Montreal that some of the priests occasionally withdraw from the customary employments and are not to be seen for some time, being understood that they have retired for religious studies, meditation, and devotion for the improvement of their hearts. Sometimes they are thus withdrawn from the world for 3 weeks, but there is no fixed period. This was a fact I knew before I took the veil, for it is a frequent subject of remark that such and such a father is on a holy retreat. This is a term which conveys the idea of a religious seclusion from the world for sacred purposes. On the reappearance of a priest after such a period in the church or the streets, it is natural to feel a peculiar impression of his devout character, an impression very different from that conveyed to the mind who knows matters as they really are. Suspicions have been indulged by some in Canada on this subject, and facts are known by at least a few. I am able to speak from a personal knowledge, for I have been a nun of Sieur Borghese. Well, that's kind of scary. That's got to be relation to Pope Francis there. Borghese. The priests are liable by their dissolute habits to occasional attacks of disease, which render it necessary, or at least prudent, to submit to a medical treatment. In the Black Nunnery, they find private accommodation They are free to enter one of the private hospitals whenever they please, which is a room set apart on purpose for the accommodation of the priest and is called a retreat room. But an excuse is necessary to blind the public, and this they find in the pretense they make of being in a holy retreat. Many such cases I have known, and I can mention the names of priests who have been confined in this holy retreat. They are very carefully attended by the superior and old nuns, and their diet consists mostly of vegetable soups, etc., with little meat, and that fresh. I have seen an instrument of surgery lying upon the table in that holy room, which is used only for a particular purposes. Father Tambo, a Roman priest, was on one of his holy retreats about the time when I left the nunnery. There are sometimes a number confined there at the same time. Victims of these priests frequently share the same fate. I have often reflected how grievously I had been deceived in my opinions of a nun's condition. All the holiness of their lives, I now saw, was merely pretended. The appearance of sanctity and heavenly mindedness which they had shown among us novices, I found was only a disguise to conceal such practices as would not be tolerated in any decent society in the world. And as for joy and peace like those of heaven, which I had expected to find among them, I learnt too well that they did not exist there. The only way in which some thoughts were counteracted was by the constant instructions given us by the superior and priest to regard every doubt as a mortal sin. Other faults we might have, as we were told over and over again, which, though worthy of penances, were far less sinful than these. For a nun to doubt that she was doing her duty in fulfilling her vows and oaths was a heinous offense, and we were exhorted always to suppress our doubts, to confess them without reserve, and cheerfully submit to severe penances on account of them, as the only means of mortifying our evil dispositions and resisting the temptations of the devil. And thus we were learnt in a good degree to resist our minds and consciences when we felt the rising of a question about the duty of doing anything required of us. To enforce this upon us, they employ various means. Some of the most striking stories told us at catechism by the priest were designed for this end. One of these I will repeat. One day, as a priest assured us who was hearing us say the catechism on Saturday afternoon, as one Monsignor Blank, a well-known citizen of Montreal, was walking near the cathedral, he saw Satan giving orders to innumerable evil spirits who were assembled around him. Being afraid of being seen, and yet wishing to observe what was done, he hid himself where he could observe all that passed. Satan dispatched his devils to different parts of the city, with directions to do their best for him. They returned in a short time, bringing in reports of their success in leading persons of different classes to the commission of various sins, which they thought would be agreeable to their master. Satan, however, expressed his dissatisfaction and ordered them out again. Just then a spirit from the Black Nunnery came, who had not been seen before, and stated that he had been trying for 7 years to persuade one of the nuns to doubt, and had just succeeded. Satan received the intelligence with the highest pleasure, and turning to the spirits around him, said, "You have not half done your work. He has done much more than all you put together." In spirit, in spite, however, of our instructions and warnings, our fears and penances, such doubt would obtrude, and I have often indulged them for a time, and at length, yielding to the belief that I was wrong in giving place to them, would confess them and undergo with cheerfulness such new penances as I was loaded with them. Others, too, occasionally entertain and privately express such doubts, though we had all been most solemnly warned by the cruel murder of St. Francis. Occasionally, some of the nuns would go further and resist the restraints of punishments imposed upon them, and it was not uncommon to hear screams, some of the most piercing and terrific kind, from nuns suffering their discipline. Some of my readers may feel disposed to exclaim against me for believing things which will strike them as so monstrous and abominable. To such I would say, without pretending to justify myself, you know little of the position in which I was placed. In the first place, ignorant of any other religious doctrines, and in the second, met at every moment by some ingenious argument and the example of a large community, who received all the instructions of the priest as of undoubted truth, and practiced upon them. Of the variety and speciousness of the arguments used, you cannot have any correct idea. They were often so ready with replies, examples, antidotes, and authorities to enforce their doctrines that it seemed to me as if they could never have learned it from books, but must have been taught by wicked spirits. Indeed, when I reflect upon their conversation, I am astonished at their art and address, and find it difficult to account for their subtlety and success in influencing my mind and persuading me anything they pleased. It seems to me that hardly anybody could be safe in their hands. If you would go to confession twice, I believe you would feel very different from what you do now. They have such a way of avoiding one thing and speaking of another, of affirming this and doubting and disputing that, of quoting authorities and speaking of wonders and miracles recently performed in confirmation of what they teach, as familiarly known to persons whom they call by name, and whom they pretend to offer as witnesses, though they never give you an opportunity to speak with them. These and many other means they use in such a way that they always blinded my mind, and I should think would blind the minds of others. Chapter 16. Treatment of young infants in the convent, walking in sleep, amusements, ceremonies, the public interments of deceased nuns, sudden disappearance of the old superior, introduction of the new one, superstition, alarm of a nun, difficulty of communication with other nuns. It will be recollected that I was informed immediately after receiving the veil that infants were occasionally murdered in the convent. I was one day in the nuns' private sick room when I had an opportunity, unsought for, of witnessing deeds of such nature. It was perhaps a month after the death of St. Francis. Two little twin babies, the children of St. Catherine, were brought to a priest who was in the room for baptism. I was present while the ceremony was performed, with the superior and several of the old nuns, whose names I never knew, they being called Ma Ante, which is aunt. The priest took turns in attending to confession and catechism in the convent, usually 3 months at a time, though sometimes longer. The priest then on duty was Father Larkin. He is a good-looking European, and has a brother who is a professor in the college. He first put oil upon the heads of the infants, as is custom before baptism. Then he had baptized the children. They were taken, one after another, by one of the old nuns in the presence of us all. I'm sorry. She pressed her hand upon She pressed her hand upon the mouth and nose of the first so tight that it could not breathe, and in a few minutes, when the hand was removed, he was dead. She then took the other and treated it in the same way. No sound was heard, and both the children were corpses. The greatest difference was shown by all present during this operation, for all, as I well knew, were long accustomed to such scenes. The little bodies were then taken into the cellar, thrown into the pit I have mentioned, and covered with a quantity of lime. I afterwards saw a newborn infant treated in the same manner and in the same place, but the actors in the scene I chose not to name, nor the circumstances, as everything connected with it is of a peculiarity, trying, and painful nature to my own feelings. These were the only instances of infanticide I witnessed, and it seemed to be merely owing to accident that I was then present. So far as I know, there were no pains taken to preserve secrecy on this subject. That is, I saw no attempt made to keep any inmate of the convent in ignorance of the murder of the children. On the contrary, others were told as well as myself on their first admission as veiled nuns. All infants born in the place were baptized and killed without loss of time. And I had been called to witness the murder of 3 just mentioned only because I happened to be in the room at the time. The others were killed in the same manner during my stay in the nunnery, I am well assured. How many there were I cannot tell, and having taken no account of those I heard of, I cannot speak with precision. I believe, however, that I learnt through nuns that at least 18 or 20 infants were smothered and secretly buried in the cellar, while I was a nun. One of the effects of the weariness of our bodies and minds was our proneness to talk in our sleep. It was both ludicrous and painful to hear the nuns repeat their prayer in the course of the night after they frequently did in their dreams. Required to keep our minds continually on the stretch, both in watching our conduct and remembering the rules and our prayers under the fear of the consequences of any neglect. When we closed our eyes in sleep, we often went over again the scenes of the day. It was not uncommon thing for me to hear a nun repeat 1 or 2 of her long exercises in the dead of the night. Sometimes, by the time she had finished another, in a different part of the room, would happen to take a similar turn. Let me say that again. Sometimes, by the time she had finished, another, in a different part of the room, would happen to take a similar turn and commence a similar recitation. I have known cases in which several such unconscious exercises were performed, all within an hour or 2. We had now and then a recreation day when we were relieved from our customary labor and from all prayer except those for morning and evening, and the short ones said at every striking of the clock. The greater part of our time was then occupied with different games, particularly backgammon and draughts, and in such conversations as did not relate to our past lives and the outside of the convent. Sometimes, however, our sport would be interrupted on such days by the entrance of one of the priests, who would come in and propose that his fete, the birthday of his patron saint, should be kept by the saints. Several nuns died at different times while I was in the convent. How many I cannot say, but there was a considerable number. I might rather say many in proportion to the number in the nunnery. The proportion of deaths, I am sure, was very large. There was always some in the nuns' sick room, and several interments took place in the chapel. When a black nun is dead, corpse is dressed as if living and placed in the chapel in a sitting position within the railing around the altar, with a book in the hand as if reading. Persons are then freely admitted from the street. Some of them read and pray before it. No particular notoriety is given, I believe, to this exhibition out of the convent, but such a case usually excites some attention. Living nuns are required to say prayers for the delivery of their deceased sister from purgatory, being informed, as in all other such cases, that if she is not there and has no need of our intercession, our prayers are in no danger of being thrown away, as they will be set down to the account of some of our deceased friends, or at least to that of the souls which have no acquaintances to pray for them. It was customary for occasionally to kneel before a dead nun thus seated in the chapel, and I have often performed that task. It was always painful for the ghastly countenance, being seen whenever I raised my eyes, and the feeling that the position and dress were entirely opposed to every idea of propriety in such a case always made me melancholy, depressed. Hmm. The superior sometimes left the convent and was absent for an hour or several hours at a time. We never knew of it until she had returned and were not informed where she had been. I one day had reason to presume that she had recently paid a visit to the priest's farm, though I had not direct evidence that such was fact. The priest's farm is a fine tract of land belonging to the seminary, a little distant from the city near the Lachine road, with a large old-fashioned edifice upon it. I happened to be in the superior's room on the day alluded to, when she made some remark on the plainness and poverty of her furniture. I replied that she was not proud and could not be dissatisfied on that account. She answered no, but if I was, how much superior is the furniture at the priest's farm? The poorest room there is furnished better than the best of mine. I was one day mending the fire in the superior's room when a priest was conversing with her on the scarcity of money, and I heard him say that very little was received by the priest for prayers, but that the principal part came with penances and absolutions. One of the most remarkable and unaccountable things that happened in the convent was the disappearance of the old superior. She had performed her customary part during the day and had acted and appeared just as usual. She had shown no symptoms of ill health, met with no particular difficulty in conducting business, and no agitation, anxiety, or gloom had been noticed in her conduct. We had no reason to suppose that during that day she had expected anything particular to occur, any more than the rest of us. After the close of our customary labors and evening lecture, she dismissed us to retire to bed exactly in her usual manner. Next morning the bell rang. We sprang from our beds, hurried on our clothes as usual, and proceeded to the community room in double line to commence the morning exercises. There, to our surprise, we found Bishop Leriquet, Lericu, I think it's Lericu, but the superior was nowhere to be seen. The bishop soon addressed us and said of her, and informed us that a lady near him, whom he presented to us, was now the superior of the convent, and enjoined upon us the same respect and obedience which we paid to her predecessor. The lady he introduced us to was one of our oldest nuns, Saint Blank, a very large, fleshly woman with swelled limbs, which rendered her very slow in walking and often gave her great distress. Not a word was dropped from which we could conjecture the cause of this change, nor of the whereabouts of the old superior. I took the first opportunity to inquire of the nuns what had become of her, but I found them as ignorant as myself, though suspicious that she had been murdered or by order of the bishop. Wow. Never did I obtain any light on her mysterious disappearance. I am confident, however, that if the bishop wished to get rid of her privately and by foul means, he had ample opportunity and power at his command. Jane Ray, as usual, could not allow such an occurrence to pass by without imitating her own suspicions more plainly than any other of the nuns would have dared to do. She spoke out one day in the community room and said, "I'm going to have a hunt in the cellar for my old superior." "Hush, Jane Ray," exclaimed some of the nuns. "You'll be punished." "My mother used to tell me," replied Jane, "never be afraid of the face of a man." It cannot be thought strange that we were superstitious. Some were more ghastly terrified than others by unaccountable sights and sounds, but all of us believed in the power and occasional appearance of spirits, and were ready to look for them at almost any time. I have seen several instances of alarm caused by such superstitions, and have experienced it myself more than once. I was one day sitting mending aprons beside one of the old nuns in the community room, while the litanies were repeating. As I was very easy to laugh, Saint Ignace or Agnes, she says, came in, walked up to her with such agitation and began to whisper in her ear. She usually talked but little, and that made me more curious to know what was the matter. I overheard her say to the old nun, in much alarm, that in the cellar from which she had just returned she had heard the most dreadful groans that ever came from any human being. This was enough to give me uneasiness. I could not account for the appearance of an evil spirit in any part of the convent, for I had been assured that the only one ever known there was that of the nun who had died with unconfessed sin, and that others were kept at a distance by the holy water that was rather profusely used in different parts of the nunnery. Oops, why do I keep doing that? Hold on. Still, I presume that the sounds heard by St. Ignace or Agnes must have proceeded from some devil, and I felt great dread at the thought of visiting the cellar again. I'm dead. I determined to seek further information of the terrified nun, and when I addressed her on the subject at recreation time, the first opportunity I could find, she replied that I was always trying to make her break silence, and walked off to another group in the room, so that I could obtain no satisfaction. It is remarkable that in our nunnery we were almost entirely cut off from the means of knowing anything, even of each other. There were many nuns whom I know nothing of to this day, after having been in the same room with them every day and night for 4 years. There was a nun whom I supposed to be in the convent, and whom I was anxious to learn something about from the time of my entrance as a novice. But I never was able to learn anything concerning her, not even whether she was in the nunnery or not. Silly dogs. Whether alive or dead. She was the daughter of a rich family, presiding at Point aux Trembles, of whom I had heard my mother speak before I entered the convent. The name of her family, I think, was Lafayette, and she was thought to be from Europe. Listen to them. She was known to have taken the black veil, but as I was not acquainted with the saint she had assumed, I could not describe her in the world. All my inquiries and observations proved entirely in vain. I have heard before my entrance into the convent that one of the nuns had made her escape from it during the last war, and once inquired about her of the superior. She admitted that such was the fact. I was never able to learn any particulars concerning her name, origin, or manner of escape. How crazy, you guys. All right. That ends chapter 16. I'm going to stop there because my little dogs want to bark like crazy. So, next time we'll pick up later. Keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. I love you all. Bye-bye.